you don't have 100% agency over everything, but you almost might as well act as if you do, because in most situations, like the things you don't have control over, I mean, it's right, you don't have control over them. You just have to chalk those up to trade off. Like, you can't do this, you can't do that. Fine, fair enough. So like within the possibility space, I still like catch myself in that, not infrequently, that I'm like, oh, I could do this. Someone will bring like, oh, you could just do X. And I'm like, oh, I could just do X actually.
There's a prayer that is act as if it is all up to you, pray as if it is all up to God.
Spread Great Ideas is meant to increase the signal in a world awash in noise. I'm your curator and host, Brian David Crane, and it is my quest to share the learnings of the world's most interesting people, the disruptors, the outliers, the libertines, and those who've been unconventionally successful so that we can become a little bit wiser together.
Please welcome my friend Taylor Pearson to the show. Taylor is a fellow father, an entrepreneur, the author of The End of Jobs, an essayist with his Interesting Times newsletter, a fellow Tennessean, one of the founders of a long-volatility and tail-risk hedge fund, and a former college football player where he played offensive line. He spent the last decade researching and writing about how you can better invest your time and money in an uncertain world. In other words, how to become antifragile. Welcome, Taylor. Thanks for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Thanks for tuning in.
All right. I was going back through my bookmarks of things that you had written on Twitter over the years, and I came across a gem that I want to start with. It is you led on a tweet here. It says the best lesson I ever got about how to stop procrastinating was from a podcast episode called The Drama Denominator. The drama denominator is a simple yet powerful concept. You are the common denominator of all the drama in your life. You haven't had 5 crappy jobs or 3 crappy relationships in a row. They did not happen to you. You happened to them. You were crappy at your job or you were crappy at your relationships. So, strong statement. Let's see a little bit more. Then you talked about a personal experience you had where you had a job teaching English that you didn't like very much. There was a moment while I was listening to the podcast that it clicked with me so clearly the problem was me, not the job. So, how does this tie in with the drama denominator being the theme that you had from The End of Jobs? And what I mean by that is that I think they both touch on agency. Is that right?
They do, yeah. And I think I remember listening to that podcast. Like you have these like distinct memories of certain things. I like remember listening to that podcast. I was teaching English in Brazil. This is the year after I graduated college, and I don't know, whatever, classic year after. I had no idea what I was doing with my life. I thought I was going to go to law school. I decided not to do that. I was trying to figure it out. Got this English teaching job. I got to be in Brazil and teach. I thought that was cool. I did that. And I think like at that point in my life, I was I guess I was in that transition phase of like everything up to then had been kind of scripted. You go to elementary school, middle school, high school, like it was kind of scripted, right? Like, at least for like my college was like more or less, that wasn't like really a decision that I made. It was just like, that was always the expectation. And I never even thought to question it. Like maybe I wouldn't go to college or something. But then after that, like you can do anything. And I think that was, I guess, like overwhelming. Like I just didn't know how to deal. Like there was like a meta problem that I'd like never had. Like I was good at school. Like, okay, here's you have to be good at school or good at sports. And I was like pretty good. I don't know. It was fine. Right. Like I got good grades and I tried hard at sports and all that kind of stuff. And then, I was just like 22 and I was dealing with this, like, oh, now I have to like pick there's not an
Something.
obvious next thing to do. Like I actually have to figure it out. Sort of thing. And so I think I was like still sort of like, I got this job teaching English. I was like, oh, I just had to like be really good at teaching English or just do this thing. And I think like in that, it was just like crummy manager, like a super classic basic situation. Like it just wasn't a good company to work at. Like, the
You're in a
school
foreign
wasn't well
country.
run. Yeah. And I was like, oh, like I'm complicit in this because like I'm letting this happen. Like I'm just letting this happen to me more or less. Like I could quit. Like I sort of, and I think that was like I don't know, I'd like never like quit something. Like I'd never quit school. I'd never, like I hadn't quit a lot of things. I just like kept sort of doing the things. Um, and so, yeah, I think like at that stage in my life, there's just like a lot of things like that where I was like, oh no, like the word agency was like very prominent in my mind. Like, oh, I have agency over this situation. Like, I can just quit this job, and there's all these things I can do, and those
But
things have
then what's next after that? Then the question
right.
becomes, yeah, like,
There's
sorry.
implications and cost and trade-offs, and all those sorts of things like have to be considered. But like the first step is like acknowledging some level of agency, and I think like you don't have 100% agency over everything, but you almost might as well act as if you do, because you know in most situations, like the things you don't have control over, like, it's right, you don't have control over them. You just have to chalk those up to trade-offs. Like, you can't do this, you can't do that. Fine, fair enough. So like within the possibility space, um, what can you do? And I think I just find I still like catch myself in that,
Mhm.
not infrequently, that I'm like, oh,
Mhm.
I could do this, and I like, someone will bring like, oh, you could just do X. And I'm like, oh, I could just do X actually. Um,
Yeah, there's
that,
there's a very sorry to interrupt you. There's a prayer that is uh,
the
pray as if,
Serenity Prayer.
yeah, it's like act as if it is all up to you, pray as if it is all up to God, or something like that.
Uh,
I don't get it exactly right, but
no,
it's
my grandma had one on her pillow that was, oh gosh, now I'm blanking on it. I have it like written on a sticky note in my room.
bring me the
Was it like,
serenity to change to accept the things I cannot change, and the strength to change the things I can, or
yeah,
something to
that's
that
right. The courage
effect.
to change the things I can,
Yeah,
the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, and the wisdom to know the difference, or something
yeah,
like that. Yeah, which
bingo.
I think
Yeah,
is, I don't know.
really
Yeah,
profound.
I remember my grandma had a pillow with that, like, what is it, knit, like quilted or stitched
Yeah,
into it, and I think about it all the time.
yeah, yeah. It's yeah, it's something that I've heard it said in different ways. Another way of saying it is like everything's your fault, although that's a bit rough for some people. And then also another one, which is why you can and can't do everything you want. And that guy's argument was that basically you cannot do things that violate the law of nature, or that other people are going to um, like basically like it's forms the core of the non-aggression principle, where you can't like you can't steal from somebody else, or like do something that violates their sovereignty. But outside of that, you can do just about anything else. But you need to know what the laws of nature are, and you also need to understand personal sovereignty to not um, to give you an idea of what you can and can't do. Like that's how you kind of like form a philosophical boundary in which you decide what what's capable for yourself.
Yeah,
I'm
I
watching you.
think,
I'm watching your face on that. What do you think about that? That was a big mouthful.
I don't know. So the word metaphysics, I think, is, it's like there's physics and like everything else is this is not literally what the word metaphysics means, but if you just like look at the two root words, it's like there's physical reality. Like you can't, you can't violate the law of thermodynamics as far as we know, right? Like that seems to be pretty robust. But like more or less everything else is negotiable. Um, and yeah, I think that's like a helpful thing. I don't know. I think that's helpful thing to mind. I think it can be taken. Sometimes people take it as an excuse to like treat other people shittily. Like I think that's one,
Mm-hmm.
like, oh, I can just do. I'm this individual entity, and like I can do anything I want, sort of thing. I think like that's maybe the naive interpretation of that. Um,
Or narcissistic one.
yeah, or narcissistic interpretation of that. But like I think there's like a healthy interpretation of that, which is just like, yeah, like let's have more agency, basically, right? Like let's
Mm-hmm.
accept that the realm of things that can change is actually quite broad, and I think that's cool and empowering. And yeah, so that podcast hit me at the right time, and I think that's, I don't know, I still find myself like reflecting back on that pretty frequently.
Did it play into, for those listening? What is the core message of the end of jobs? And did your experience in Brazil teaching English, did it how did it play into the creation of that book?
So I guess kind of the end of job, the way I've been describing it now, it's sort of like I'm going to call it like a career self-help book that was sort of like the internet changed a bunch of stuff about how business and careers and industries work, and like you can take advantage of that, and that's kind of an interesting opportunity. um, I think sort of one of the through lines of that is basically like the role technology plays in like agency, right? I think Kevin Kelly has a great book called What Technology Wants. He talks about this little bit more philosophically than I talked about it, but like more technology means you can do more things, right? Like there's no Bach without a piano, or I don't know
Mm.
whatever the
Yeah,
precursor to the
Beethoven
piano
without a
was to
piano.
use. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, and so you can just like do more stuff, right? And I think I yeah, grew up in Memphis, Tennessee, went to like a small school in Alabama, graduated in 2011, and like I didn't know anyone doing anything remotely tech. Like I think most of my friends from college, like they just worked at a bank, went to law school, like just normal stuff, sold insurance, like just kind of the typical things. And I like found all this internet stuff. Like I remember I was like listening to podcasts my senior year in college, 2011, and like the podcasts were like not a thing then. Like the top business podcasts on iTunes in 2011 got like 10,000 downloads an episode.
Mm.
And what Rogan gets like 50 mil. I don't know, whatever he's at. Like it was, you know what I mean? It was just this like super niche, um, weird thing. But then, and I mean, this world, but like you could just like do all this stuff on the internet all of a sudden, and
And anywhere
all
in the
this
world.
anywhere in the world, and it all sounds like a little utopia now, but like no gatekeepers, et cetera, et cetera. And I mean that the book came out in 2015. It's probably less true now than it was then, but like, yeah, I mean, and you saw all these people that started a business on their laptop doing SEO, like all these things, AdWords arbitrage, like there was just all these things going on, and it was just I was thought that was just like really cool and interesting, and basically you could leverage the technology to do more new, cool stuff. But kind of my basic thesis was just that we were going through this transitional period where entrepreneurialism, not necessarily starting a business, but thinking more entrepreneurially about your career life was going to become increasingly important.
And you
And
take
that
more
like,
agency over it,
yeah, I
basically.
learned some business process in this big company and I can basically coast on that for 30 years because I'm really hard to replace. And this business process is complex, right? Like I think that was like legitimately a viable thing you could do for a long time. Um, and like that was less true. And I think I know we're going to talk about some history stuff later. You'd
Yep.
send over, but I was listening to a podcast that was talking about like the sort of post World War II industrial boom in the U.S. and like how much of that was like socially, like you got back from like fighting a world war, you saw people die, and like just being able to show up 9 to 5 and do some stuff and go home, like I can imagine that being real. Like if I'd just
It's
been
like heaven on
through
earth.
the most horrific, chaotic, whatever experience you could basically imagine, and like half my friends are dead, like it'd be nice to clock in and clock out and
Mm-hmm.
like sit on a business process and like you know what I mean, have a
Mm-hmm.
barbecue, and I guess when I
Mm-hmm.
go through those chaotic, there's periods too where I'm just like everything's been hectic and I'm stressed and like, yeah, I just want to like sit at home and watch football on TV
Mm-hmm.
and have a beer and like not try to pursue, you know what I mean? So
Yep. Not
um
intellectualize, not think about
yeah,
A, B, and C. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you had written, I know you're a golfer. I was going to ask if golf is one of the ways in which you not tune out, recharge, let's say.
Yeah, no, I don't. That's a good word. It's I think it's yes. I think I don't know. It's a nice way to go for a long walk and have enough going on to be sufficiently distracted that you can't think about anything. It's not a super intense sport. Obviously, it's the least. I don't know if it's even a sport.
Yeah.
But it's like you got to think about hitting the ball and where you want to hit the ball and what club you want to hit the ball with, and like it has like a almost maybe like TV, right? Like it engages you a little bit, but not so much that it's like super stimulating. So yeah, I find it very like there's for sure like a meditative quality to it.
Are you going golfing by yourself or you're going with friends when you're doing this most of the time?
Probably 50-50.
Okay.
Yeah. I like both. It's fun. It's fun to play with friends. Sometimes it's nice to just like, yeah, put on some music and play by myself.
Yeah. Nice. All right. So let's jam on some history stuff because I had written something down for you that I really something else you wrote that you really like. Anybody who's listening to this who is not subscribed to Interesting Times, it's a very good newsletter. Taylor curates both the best of what he finds elsewhere online, and he also writes essays and shares them with his newsletter list. This is from one of the newsletters. It says, while reading the newspaper or magazine often feels productive in the moment, my experience looking back has been that it is seeing the long arcs of history that has allowed me to make better sense of today's events, or at least think I'm able to make better sense of today's events. So a caveat there. So he says, in some small way, studying history takes us out of the details of our limited life experience and gives us a look at the breadth and depth of the human condition. In that vein, I've put together the top 10 history books which have most shaped my thinking about how the past, about both the past and what it means for the present. The list heavily biases biographies. Why? Because I found the narrative structure of biographies to be more helpful in actually understanding the impact and shape of history. Humans are narrative driven creatures, and it's easier to read and learn from a story than a dry list of events. For example, if you want to learn about post World War II America and American business following the World War II, you'd be hard pressed to do a better biography than one of Warren Buffett. If you'd like to understand the history of finance, what better way than a biography of J.P. Morgan? These books are quote unquote epic in the sense that they are long. The shortest on the list that you put together is 496 pages, and the longest is over 1,200. History is complex and interdependent. Seemingly small and meaningless events can end up having a tremendous impact. So, are these history books? Well, since you wrote that, I think that was also in 2018, if I remember correctly. You're thinking around history books. Has it changed? Are the top 10 still the top 10? Um, do you still do you still gravitate towards biographies when it comes to history? Are you more, you and I are both fans of William Manchester, who does write some biographies, but also writes mm, like period pieces, let's say, where he focuses on
Yeah.
individuals, but
He's a
it's
world lit
not.
only by fire too. That's William
Yep.
Manchester's really, yeah.
Yep.
Um, yeah, mostly still biographies. I try to think. Um, I've read the LBJ Caro series since 2018, so that would certainly have to go in the top 10. Um,
I'm reading that one now.
I think, yeah, it's cool. I'm in Austin, so it's funny. I mean, lots of the early books,
Mhm.
lots of the events are happening places I recognize, which is fun. Um, and then there's no other like really great history. Actually, I reread the House of Morgan finance series, so I would certainly keep that one in there. But yeah, it's still mostly biographies. Um, yeah, I do like some of the. I went through. I guess I found like a bit of an age of exploration. I don't know. I've read like Conquerors pops to mind. Just like a nice history of like the early Portuguese Empire.
Mm.
When they like get over to Goa. Um, but yeah, I think biographies in general are easier to follow. I guess it's hard to do biographies when you go back more than a few hundred years. I think just for research purposes, right? Because like there's not sufficient literature on in the 1400s to like write a material biography of someone's day to day life, right? Like there's plenty of like people know what FDR was doing more or less every
Got
day,
it.
right? Like there's tons of records and memos of um, all his public office and schooling and stuff. But yeah, I think I find as I read more history books, I think maybe like the timely stuff becomes more interesting because I have some sort of like overall structure to hang it off of.
Hmm.
I do love. Actually, I was in Madrid a few weeks ago and went to the Prada and the Reina Sofia, which are the two like 20th century, are two of the 20th century art museums there. And the AI, I was using the Claude, like
To
the
learn about
AI
what you were
stuff
looking
is
at.
like, yeah, so cool. Like, what is the like what was going on economically in Spain in the 1920s? Like the backdrop as a museum guide, and so I don't know. I find myself using more and more of that stuff for history because you're able to like just really specific questions that would be like hard to find a specific book on.
Mm.
You can sort of like piece together in an interesting way and like yeah, like I think for me like economic financial history is interesting and then like thinking about how that like overlaps with technology or culture, like how all these things sort of go together. And it's hard to like write a book. There's not like really a clear thesis to like turn into a book there, but I do find my like self like doing more and more of as I'm reading other books, like being able to like more or less come up like what's going on, what's the backdrop, what was going on for this author at the time they wrote this book, that kind of stuff.
And do you feel that? You studied history in university, right?
I did, yeah.
And you know, let's say post university, Taylor Pearson, does he have this thirst for history? Let me ask this a different way, and I'll tell it with a small personal story, which is I didn't study history in university. Like my interest in history became much more pronounced. I don't know, so let's call it like my mid 20s onwards, and oftentimes when I'm reading books now, I want to talk about conquerors in a minute and the Portuguese Empire and how this small nation was able to, colonize or conquer so much of the world. Because that's like a fascinating story. But that kind of a story where you go, I wish I would have learned about this in school. Do you feel like when you came out of university in Alabama that you had a, let's call it that overarching framework of world events by which to hang things on?
No, not really. I don't. It's like I don't know how useful like a modern university structure is for history. Like, it's not clear to me. What's the like line from Good Will Hunting? Like, you paid all this money for this education that you could have gotten with like $32 in late fees at a public library. Like,
Yeah.
I don't, like I had a really I enjoyed being in. I feel like a lot of people are like, oh, I hated college. I actually really enjoyed college. I thought it was super fun. I liked going to classes. I liked writing papers. I liked reading all the books. Like, I thought that was great. So I really enjoyed it. I think probably I didn't have without some structure would have had the discipline at that point in my life to sit down and like read 30 books a year and write papers about them. Probably not. Um,
But
but I didn't.
sorry, were they trying to instill in you like this, like a almost like a classical education as far as like understanding Western culture from like Greco-Roman times up to now, or was it that you did deep dives on specific topics with these 30 books and the essays that you wrote
It was
when
like
in
specific. I take a
university?
class like modern, like 19th century China or something, right? And then
Okay,
the professor would be an expert in that, and you'd read 10 books on relevant to that topic. And I think at least the school I was in, I don't know how different history departments work, but like I think the main thing I took out of it that was probably like you wouldn't just get from reading books is like the concept of historiography, which
explain
is
that
like
concept. Yeah,
the
please.
history of history, right? So I went to school in Alabama, and we all did the like your like sort of sophomore year project, which was, and then your senior project. Like when you were writing like an academic history paper, you would have to write the history of the thing, but then you'd also write like the history of the history. So we all did. The class was around the Civil War, so you'd pick the American Civil War. So you'd pick some topic relevant to the American Civil War, and you'd read about it, and you'd write a paper about your sort of thesis on that. Topic, but then you'd also have to write a history of the history, which is to say, like, so if you're reading American Civil War history, like the first 10 or 15 years after the Civil War, a bunch of books come out, and they tend to either be like hagiographies from the side, hagiographies of Robert E. Lee or something that was this great thing that was lost, or this like very vitriolic, this thing that destroyed us, all these evil people, sort of things. And then you had basically the 100-year anniversary of the Civil War was during the Civil Rights Movement in the U.S. And so you had a bunch of new books come out about the Civil War that was now kind of being told through this like social lens of what was going on in America around
Race relations.
civil rights reforms
Yeah.
and race relations, and what was the role, what was the history of that in America, and what role did the Civil War play in that, kind of thing.
because
And then
because so much of the civil rights movement was tied up in things that were happening in the South and Alabama and these kind of places, and where they would talk about things like states' rights, and George Wallace used to often talk about, like, yeah, it was the same arguments being made as in the lead up to the Civil War, which was like state being Alabama or Louisiana or whatnot, Mississippi has a right to do certain things, and the federal government can go pound sand, right?
um, yeah, and then obviously then the political bias of the people writing um, the books or whatever. And I think that's probably like academically. I don't. Most people that just read a bunch of history books don't tend to think about that. I find, unless you, I don't know, at some point you read a bunch of history books and you realize like, oh, these are all. I don't know, you read 10 books on FDR, and like there's a bunch of different ways you can interpret FDR's role in America, right? Um, and so I think that probably like academically, that was like the thing that I took away that's like very useful. Is I tend to like when I'm reading a history book, I tend to be very cognizant of like when did the book come out? What is the like background of the author that's writing it?
What
Like
axe does he have to grind?
yeah, what or
who's
just
he trying to correct? Yeah.
even more charitably, just like what innate bias and like worldview do they bring to it that they're being totally honest with their sort of view, but it's like they still have we all have our own sort of like preconceptions and that kind of
Mm-hmm.
thing. So I tend to be I don't know that's my observations. Just that's probably the biggest thing I got of like a formal history education is I tend to be much more cognizant of those factors and just much more I don't know like dubious. I read a little bit more skeptically about like why were these events in the book? You know what I mean, right? Like they
Mm-hmm.
selected the events that were in the book. They composed the narrative of the book, and yeah, I don't know. FDR is a big example. Like you can tell so many different stories about FDR. Like I can give you whatever your political bias is. I can give you some story about FDR that caters to what you want it to sort of like cater to. And so,
Yep.
which of those is true, and what should we learn from that? And that it gets very subjective at that point.
Yeah, I found that William Manchester, he wrote a book about FDR. It wasn't only about FDR, but he did talk about Yalta as one of the Yalta conference in which the U.S., the British, and the Soviets were not they weren't Soviets, they were Soviets. Were meeting to kind of like decide post World War II plans, and that the Republicans post Yalta always pointed at that event as a means of making whatever point they wanted to about FDR. And the way Manchester frames Yalta in that book is he's like, he talks about the issue, he talks about it in a way that you pick up some of his opinions about it, but he's very careful in his languaging. And then you go back and read it and you can kind of see how he talks about different presidents, talks about Eisenhower, talks about Truman, and I think he's aware of his own biases as a historian, and so he tries to be very neutral in his language as far as how he describes each of these personalities and why they made the decisions that they made. Because I think he's also quite sympathetic to what you're talking about, sort of selection bias, as far as saying, "Yeah, I chose this event to be in this book because I'm trying to tell a meta. I'm trying to tell a meta story or make a meta point." Right?
Yeah, and yeah, I think. I mean, it's hard to do that. In some ways, I feel like it just. I kind of like those words like, look, this is my bias. Like, here's where I'm coming from. Now, here's the book, right? And it's like, all right, cool. Like, you know what I mean? Like, I'm just gonna read it through that lens and like, fair enough, sort of things. And
Mm-hmm.
I think that's the approach I tend like. I have a bias. I
Mm-hmm.
have a particular worldview along a bunch of different dimensions or whatever. And so, to the extent I can try to just like make that explicit, like, look, I'm not sure this is true, but this is kind of where I'm coming from, and this is written from
Mm-hmm.
my perspective. So, you know, you
Take
filter it from there.
Yep, yep, yep. Your mileage may vary. Let's say, yeah. What
Yeah,
what what is it? What is your bias? If you and what I mean by what is your bias? When you and I saw each other in Austin in January, we were talking. You mentioned at some point you would like to write your own history book or books. Potentially, what would be in the intro to those history books about what would be your bias? You basically say like, cool, hey, I'm Taylor. Here's how I see the world. I'm like, yeah, I don't know. Like I'm pro socialist, I'm pro capitalist, I'm pro union, I'm pro Confederacy. I don't know what you'd say in it, but like what would be the bias?
I think I had this idea a few years ago. I don't think this is like a novel idea, but like I was calling them like philosophies of history. But I just when I noticed that people talking about interpreting current events or people writing history books or whatever, like they tend to think of like some force as the driver, right? That like so like I was trying to come up with like funny names or like clever names um like Carlotta Perez or Balaji Srinivasan or the Sovereign Individual, sort of a class of like I would call like technologically driven history, which tends to be like technology is the driving force, that technology happens and then there's sort of downstream economic, cultural implications of that. And that's us sort of like coping with Marshall McLuhan comes to mind, right? We shape our tools and our tools shape us, right? That's probably the one that's probably my, that of all the schools I could kind of come up with, that's like probably the one that I'm like most influenced by and tend to think most. I tend to think of like technology happens mostly in an amoral way. It's, right. There's just some set of combination of ideas and things that happen, and we shape our tools and our tools shape us, right? Like I think that's probably the most like succinct framing. That like we have smartphones, right? And once you have a smartphone, I think about like, right, the internet came along. No one's idea in the internet was, well, the internet's, instead of having a newspaper, you're going to have a feed. And if you scroll on a feed, you can place ads in the feed, and you can deliver content algorithmically to maximize people's attention within the context of this feed, which you can't do in a newspaper because you have to print it, the same one for everything. And then, okay, if you deliver content algorithmically, you shape people's worldviews in a different way than if everyone's reading the same newspaper or watching Dan Rather. There was no one who was like working on the internet in like the late 80s, early 90s, like, oh, well, this is clearly how it's going to happen, and those will be the downstream implications, right? They're just like, oh, it's like cool, you can do this stuff with like computers now, and you can connect them, and so that tends to be my bias. And I guess like I would contrast that Peter Zeihan, I know, is like a big, like he has a very geographic sort of demographic view of history, right? Like he tends to weight those favors or weight those factors like much more heavily than I weight those factors. Or like Francis Fukuyama has a very sort of like institutionalist view of history, right? That we create these institutions, government institutions, corporate institutions, limited liability company, et cetera, and like those sort of become the defining features. So I think like all those are certainly true in their own way. Or like I think there's like certainly a cultural history, right? Like you have these cultural issues that come up, right? And these cultural issues end up being the ones that drive policy, how people shape choices that shapes, So my bias tends to be, I tend to think of like technology as the driving force, and then like the other things tend to coalesce around that. But like certainly it's more complex than that. It's not that we can come up with some deterministic theory of history where you have some new technology and you could even in theory work out all the different stuff that happens.
Where does the great man theory fall into this? And are you familiar with the great man theory as I say that?
Yeah, no, I am. I tend to be, I was I guess I kind of like equate the great man to like the hedgehog and the fox sort of thing from Isaiah Berlin, which is basically his idea is there's like two types of great men. One is the hedgehog, which tends to know one big thing, and the fox, which tends to know lots of little things. And so like the great man theory is like a very like hedgehoggy theory, and my thing that like you have this one person, Rockefeller, FDR, or whatever, and typically when you're like typically a biography ends up being a sort of great man, right? Because it just, that's the narrative through line, and so like it just sort of works from like a writing perspective to like FDR did this, like the causality is almost implicitly written in that way, if not explicitly. FDR did this, and then people in Texas had electricity, right? In rural tech, right? And but like maybe, what did copper prices come down 50% over that period? And like that was part of the reason people, right? Like those sorts of things. So I tend to be like, I don't know, if 10 out of 10, scale of 1 to 10, 10 out of 10 is like, it's all great men. 1 out of 10 is it's no great men. I'm probably like a 2 or a 3. Like I tend to think it's more, I tend to think the great man theory is more a product of like our need to narrativize a complex and messy reality than it is like any one individual can like materially shape the course of history that much. Like I guess I tend to think like more that there is a vacuum that someone is going to step into, and it just so happens that like X person stepped into that vacuum. Like, was it that the structure of the oil industry in the early 1900s like lended itself to centralization and like one major company because the economies of scale were so beneficial? and
That
that
somebody was going to
Rockefeller
do
just
it.
happened to be the person that did that? Or was it that, oh no, we could have had this totally alternative history where like oil was this super fragmented thing, and Rockefeller, through sheer force of will and determination, basically overcame these forces. So I tend to think more like it's more complex than this, and people step into it.
You're famous, in my mind. You did have a phrase about reality has much more detail and color than one anticipates. I'm butchering that phrase. What's the phrase? Reality.
Reality has a surprising amount of detail.
Thank you. Is that also what you're saying when you use that phrase?
Yeah, exactly. I love all Tolstoy is probably like my favorite author. Like, I mean, Tolstoy's like very foxy. Like, if you ever read like Anna Karenina or War and Peace or all his like famous uh, like War and Peace is basically it's like this like big cope that like actually Napoleon wasn't that. Basically a bunch of little tiny unpredictable shit happened, and that's like all led to Napoleon. And it wasn't actually that Napoleon was this like
Brilliant
great, huge,
strategist.
influential thing. Yeah, and I'm sure there's like some very classic scenes of this, and where it's like there's this like big classic battle, and like some guy trips and like falls on his face, and his whole regiment retreats, and like that's the turning point in the battle, right? And then the story afterwards is like, oh, and Napoleon had this genius flanking maneuver. It was like there would just happen to be a rock there, you know what I mean? And like the guy that was leading the charge fell, and everyone else turned around at that point. And then we like tell this story afterwards, because of course no one saw the guy fall in there. You could how could you possibly know all the complex causality of that?
Yeah, I think there's also something in the story of the South when it comes to the Civil War that speaks to that as well. The more that you learn about the Civil War, in my experience, that you will become, at least my readings of it were like there was so many small decisions that were made that made it so that idolizing somebody like Lee or denigrating somebody like I don't know Grant. Although it was like they were both they were brilliant. I don't want to say they were not in their own ways, but also they were still prisoners of their circumstances, and that the circumstances, the person tripping on the route or whatnot in the battle that you're talking about with Napoleon, that stuff happened all over the place in a lot of these stories, and it tends to be downplayed or down. It's not told in a way because it doesn't lend itself to the narrative structure of the book, which is talking about Napoleon as a great leader, right? Like you're reading the book because you already admire or think that Napoleon is a fascinating character, so you're like susceptible to whatever Napoleon did, not not the second lieutenant who happened to bumble the order and or like didn't wake up because like he was with his mistress the night before, whatever the story is, like
Right.
I don't know, yeah. So you also had an interesting phrase. I want to hear what this is about, which is called modelers versus intersectionalists when it comes to history. What do you mean by those two phrases?
I think I was quoting someone else. I don't. Yeah, I don't. The intersectional was a word that had like a lot of play around. Was sort of like trying to classify bias and stuff. So I guess I kind of treat it as like there's sort of like a cultural theory of history there, relative versus like I don't know, more of like a technology economically driven theory of history there. And I
Okay.
tend to be more in like the technology. I don't know. I guess I tend to like sort of technology is upstream of economics, which is like upstream of culture, which is upstream of politics. I kind of think about the cause that, and like again, certainly
Hmm.
that's oversimplified. Like there's a ton of feedback loops that we could sit here and come with a bunch of explanation, a bunch of examples of that not being, or probably not being the case, but that tends to be like the mode, which is to say like to what extent are like to me cultural things tend to be downstream of
Technology, which is downstream of what was the layers again?
sort of like technology feeds into like economic logic, which feeds into I guess economic and let's call it like military logic. I don't, in present times, the military logic is probably less impactful. It doesn't matter until it matters a lot.
Yeah.
Um, and then like that tends to be cultural, and then like politics tends to be mostly just like reacting to whatever that sort of like cultural thing is, right? Like, and I'd like, you have the internet, then you have social media, right, which has like certain cultural implications, and like politics is reacting to those cultural implications. Like that's how I tend to think about that.
Yeah, what's interesting to me in that is that you and I both are reading books about political figures, LBJ, Robert Moses in New York, who were influencing. They were downstream. They were at the political level, right? So, how do I frame my question? Do you think that it's if you're at the, let's call it the fourth order effect, politics being downstream of these other three? Is it just that we like human narrative history, which is why we talk about the what's happening at the political level, or that's what gets written about?
Well, I mean, we're talking like FDR, I feel like LBJ, like, of
That's
course,
what I
like
meant.
they
If
had.
I
I
said
mean,
if I said FDR, I meant LBJ. I was talking about, yeah.
yeah, no, but like, it doesn't matter. Yeah, whoever it is. Like obviously they make economic like obviously it's more complex, right? Like I like what I can give a counter argument. I think right now is like to what extent did like DARPA right fund the whole internet thing, right? Which right like so clearly it's like circular and there's like a bunch of feedback loops and stuff, right? Um,
For those who don't know,
so
DARPA is a Department of Defense skunk works research lab that basically crafted the version one of the internet. Is that right?
yeah, the government funded entity that built a bunch of like they did a bunch of the theoretical work and built a bunch of like the early infrastructure that became like the World Wide Web, the internet as we know it now. But yeah, I can't remember where I was going with that. But yeah, like so, I think clearly it's more complex, and there's like just this one um, downstream causality. But I guess yeah, I do tend to add it like, and I mean politicians play into this all the time. But like, there was I'm trying to remember the name of the book. It was a nice book, but the guy came up with basically like a two-factor model for predicting political elections, and it was basically like factor one was like basically like real wages over the like 12 to 24 months leading up to the election, right? Like were people making more money in real terms than they were? And then like strong cultural affiliations. So like I want to say like leading up to JFK's election, I'm making these numbers up, but this is like vaguely right. Like Catholics 70% of the time voted Republican,
Mm-hmm.
and then JFK got the Democratic nomination. For that one election, 70% of Catholics like voted Democrat, and then the next election they all switched back to voting Republican. Like exactly as the trend line was like exactly the same, except for this like one blip where it just like super switched, right? Because he was the first Catholic president.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and it was just, but like I guess the economic point being like I think people tend to like ascribe like, oh, the president or Congress is going to come in and like do all this stuff and it's going to like matter, right?
In the
Like people tend to describe like, oh, this, and like I don't. The Fed is all like, oh, the Fed did this, and that's like what caused all these sorts of things. Like, I'm like pretty dubious. Like, I'm pretty dubious of that. That there's like this like really clear causality where like these political actors are doing these things, and like certainly whatever you cut the funding to an institution to zero, like of course that closes the institution. Like there's certain things like that. But like broadly, it seems like mostly like those forces, like the correlation between like how much can the president and or Congress impact GDP in the short to medium term, like I think very little.
But is
um
that a function of the fact that the unit of measure is funky? Let's say, right, like GDP's, to use that example, but the one of I think I would argue, and I will make this argument, that the Fed, along with the Treasury, in the '08 financial crisis, is, well, let's say the people in power in Washington, because Fed, Treasury, the Bush administration, then the Obama administration were entirely culpable for the too big to fail, like let's take on more risk, post '08 financial crisis. There is like heads I win, tails you lose,
financial model. Like it's clearly, to me, is like clearly a policy decision or a series of policy decisions that said these financial institutions are not going to be allowed to fail. We're not going to allow the animal spirits to run, and as a result, like we now have banks that are bigger than ever, and that, yeah, like either explicitly or certainly implicitly are not going to go to zero, right? And those are due to policy decisions, I would say.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think like I think like did the COVID fiscal stimulus lead to inflation? Like probably, right? Like probably
Mm-hmm.
sending people a bunch of checks that they spent.
Mm-hmm.
You can never prove
Mm-hmm.
the causality there. Um, but yeah, yeah, no, that's true. I, mean, I guess I guess the counterpoint I think like I think I talk about like COVID specifically, like or the I mean the '08 financial crisis too to some yeah to like the question of like exogenous versus endogenous factors that like lead to these sorts of things. So like I
Explain
think the
those two
policy
terms.
um for COVID, for example, exogenous is like something external that came in. So like you would call like, okay, was the crash in COVID caused by exogenous factors, which was there was this virus that came out of the Wuhan province of China and caused all this stuff to happen, right? And that was reflected in financial markets. Or like to what extent was it endogenous, which is to say there's like certain structural factors in financial markets themselves
Mm.
that then led to this thing. So
And that
like
if the market hadn't already been, let's call it, overheated, that, or if it had been more durable or more anti-fragile, to come back to your intro, that it wouldn't have had such a, like, a scare or a drop from the threat of COVID. Is that right?
correct, yeah. So I guess I give an example with COVID is like if you read Systemantics by John Gall, the Systems Bible, it's great. You would probably like it. I suspect you would like it, and your audience would probably like it. It's just like a very kind of tongue-in-cheek systems thinking book. But one of his like fun quotes is the army is always fully prepared to fight the previous war, right? So like
Mm.
France was fully prepared for World War One when Germany invaded World War II. They had the big concrete fortress
Yeah, the
ready for the trench warfare on
Maginot Line. Yeah.
up on the border or whatever, and Germany had tanks and they just went around. Um, and so anyway, so I guess like one like I give an example with um, COVID, like there was a bunch of changes as a result of the global financial crisis into how banks were regulated, and a lot of like trading that had happened at big banks moved to other institutions.
Like
And
hedge
like
funds, or what does that mean? What's another
yeah,
institution?
hedge funds or a lot of it like became algorithmic. And so like one of the implications of that was that if you're like a bank and you have a fund, you like typically you're doing trades with your they're like one of your counterparties. Like part of that relationship is maybe this isn't the ideal time I want to do this trade or the ideal price, but we have a long-standing right. Like you have a long-standing business relationship with someone. You're looking at it as this sort of like iterated game of like, all right, this isn't exactly what I want to do right now, but this is a good relationship I've had for 10 years, and I think it'll be good. So like the fact that this particular trade isn't exactly the trade I want to do, and so like one implication of that was banks would often be providers of liquidity when you had these sort of big market dislocations that the trading desk at banks that had these really big balance sheets, right, could step in and do this. And
Yeah,
like
but
one of the
what
things
does
that
that mean? What does that mean for somebody who's listening? It basically means that the bank would step in and buy junk or stuff that one of these partners was selling when nobody else wanted to buy.
yeah, or I guess like when you have lots of uncertainty come in, like often like spreads will blow out. So like let's say you have a stock and like typically like a highly liquid stock or ETF, like your spread is going to be like fractions of a penny, right? Like it's trading for 100. The bid is $100 and the ask is like 1 penny off of it, right? But
Mm-hmm.
what you see in these like bit when volatility, you get these big market dislocations, like they like spreads will blow out, right? I'm supposed to say like there's a ton of uncertainty. So like something that used to trade at a penny spread is now trading at 10 cents or something, so these spreads get really wide. And like that of course exacerbates the volatility because like what does it mean when something is like you're having to cross a big spread to trade? Like there's a big price movement. And so
Well, there's also the human dynamic, which is you're scared because everybody else is scared. You're looking at this going, I'm used to it only trading with 1 penny, um, between the bid and ask, and now it's $1. What does everybody else know that I don't, or what is the risk that I can't see, right?
and and I guess liquidity and price are like, a house, real estate is illiquid, but if you want to sell it for 50% less than it's worth, you can sell it tomorrow. No problem, right? So, price and liquidity are linked in that way. And so, right. So you had these like post GFC reforms, a bunch of the banks were no longer doing this relationship business. A bunch of this was done algorithmically, and all the algorithms said like spreads blow out. We don't know what's going to happen. We don't want to take a bunch of this risk. We're just like out of the market, right? And so something that used to be super liquid, that was trading whatever X number of shares per day, is now trading 1/10 X. And like, what does that do? Like, it can create a feedback effect, right? Where, now the price is going down faster because you don't have someone that's willing to step in and, offer the liquidity, because, it's no longer this like reciprocal relationship thing. So I like,
Well, it's a computer
to
now,
what
right?
extent was COVID an
Instead of
exogenous
sorry,
bias? Yeah, go
yeah.
ahead.
No, it's like you're not picking up the phone to call the person you've done business with for the past 10 years. It's the algorithm saying, based on my parameters, I'm just not going to participate in the market any longer, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so I guess to what extent was COVID an exogenous event caused by a virus that came out of Wuhan, China, versus to what extent was it there was just something that happened and there was a
Mm-hmm.
bunch of endogenous market structure that was like primed to do this, and like that thing could have been a virus from Wuhan, China, it could have been whatever. I think it also like, I don't know, like or like the Russia Ukraine thing happened, and like the market just went straight up. It's like, wait, well, what's going on? Like we have a land war in Asia. You know what I mean? So I tend to think it's more endogenous market structure factor. And to your point, like certainly long-term policy like I just basically made a policy argument, right? Which is like there was reforms put on the banks post global financial crisis, and that affected how the banks operate, and like that sort of created this endogenous. So like certainly in the long run, I do think that's right. Like, and like DARPA, like in the long run, the policy actually matters like quite a bit, but like in the, I
But
don't
maybe
know,
not in the way
month
intended.
and often in ways that were like, certainly like DARPA wasn't funded with the idea of like Facebook being created, like, it was right, like there was no foresight into how that was gonna um, play out.
And I think that's the part that you and I would say very much agree on when it comes to reading history, is that you start to see patterns and patterns of unintended consequences that lead in all kinds of ways that were never considered at the time that certain decisions were made. And I don't know if does it make you, what's the term I'm looking for? Does it make you more comfortable making decisions? Does it make you a little bit more leery of making decisions when, as you read some of these books and you go, okay, cool. Like I can see how. I use Vietnam as an example of, like how in 1955, when Dulles was, I don't know, he was Secretary of State, and he was going around the world signing alliances and agreements that tied the U.S. into certain things like that. 55 to 75 thread started from a decision that Dulles made in the State Department, and it led through. He's not at fault for it, but like that was the initial the U.S. becoming entangled in Vietnam or in Southeast Asia, and then it goes all the way through 75 with the pullout and the fall of Saigon and the 40-something thousand American soldiers who died in Vietnam. Like there's like you start to read this stuff, and a lot of times I'm like, you can see that just like it's the story of unintended consequences. That's often what I come away from history books thinking. I don't know if that resonates with you.
Yeah, there's I think I learned this from like Derek's. There's like, I think it's a Chinese parable, or maybe an apocryphal Chinese parable. It's like, there's a kid born in a village, and everyone's so excited and says congratulations. And then sort of this, the old wise man, it's like, oh, well, we'll see how it goes. And then the kid grows up and breaks his leg. And everyone's like, oh, it's such a shame he broke his leg. That's so sad. And the old man goes, oh, well, we'll see how it goes. And then a war breaks out, but the kid doesn't have to go fight in the war because he's got a broken leg. And so he's got an excuse of, oh, how wonderful. And there's like 4 or 5 iterations of this sort of thing goes on, right? But like something happens, the first order effect is obviously good or bad, and everyone reacts to that. And then there's some second order effect. And so, yeah, I tend to think in those terms. And I think in some ways, like, it can also be like, I don't know, debilitating or like disempowered, because it's like, well, if I can't possibly know anything that's going to happen from anything, then like nothing matters and it's all da 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 da. And so I
Yeah,
think,
like leads to nihilism, right?
yeah, right. And I think, I don't know, you have to walk the line, right? Like you can take that too far, right? Which nothing I do, nothing matters. It's all unpredictable. And so da
Mm-hmm.
da da. But I think there's some like healthy balance of like, look, I'm trying to make some reasonable assessment over like how much control I or anyone else has over this situation, and like to the extent we can think through the consequences of that, like what are some reasonable and appropriate ways we could go about that, right? And I think that's healthier than one, nothing matters and it's all uncontrollable and we just give it all away. Or also I have complete, we can, the hubris of like, oh, like, no, I'll just come in and fix this, and like sort of a more pure great man theory of like I can control all this and it's all sort of doable. And I think to some extent that's like a trader's mentality. You can't make, no matter how hard you try, the market won't do what you want it to do.
Mm.
And I think to the extent you can use financial markets as an analogy of just, a complex system, which are a subset of even broader, all the things, political systems, technological paradigms, et cetera. Like, okay, it's not going to do what I want it to do, but I do have some agency over like how I'm reacting to it and how I'm interacting with it.
And how is it? Yeah, there's a lot there to unpack. One of the questions that comes up for me is, if somebody comes to you, a younger version of Taylor, and says, I want to become a better decision maker. Given what you just said, what would you counsel them to do, or how do you? I know some people come to you and they say Taylor seems to make wise decisions, or at least he comes up with wise frameworks as far as how to come up with decisions. What does that look like? What does 22-year-old Taylor, who's sitting in Brazil weighing the decision to leave the English school and all the second order effects that come out of it, we'll see, as the wise man says in your Chinese parable. um, yeah, how do you come up with better decision making?
I think my broad framework now, um, and maybe this is going to sound a bit evasive, and I'm not trying to be evasive, but um, sort of all things are context dependent, right? Which is like, if I used to do like a lot of email marketing stuff. You go ask me how to make a good decision about like optimizing your email marketing front. I'm not as good at that as I used to be, but like I could give you an answer with high certainty that was like pretty good, right? Like I had a bunch of domain expertise. I had done that a bunch of times. I'd seen it a bunch of ways. Like my intuition around, you know, I worked for an e-commerce company, like e-commerce email marketing, funnel optimization was like very good. Um, and that's like a pretty discrete system. And so, if you ask, how do we fix U.S. industrial policy? Like, my confidence bands are like much wide. You know what I know? Like, I have some ideas of that's like do a ton more research. Even after doing 5 years of research, like my confidence bands would still be really wide. It's super complex. And so I think having some like basically having some sense for the underlying complexity that you're doing. Like, what is the appropriate amount of humility or to have in the situation, because like sometimes you
Mm-hmm.
can be too humble and like, look, no, like let's just fix the thing, it's clear what needs to get done here. And sometimes it's like it is the sort of Chinese man
We'll see.
um parable, we'll see
Mm.
sort of thing. So I think I try to make some assessment, like I don't know if I'm thinking about like investing, like there's nothing I'm going to be able to do that's going to make the market do, you know what I mean? Like my ability to control that is extremely limited. My ability to control um what things in is my car going to function properly, like whatever, I can do that, I can get it serviced, I can, like, that's mostly with it, that's 98% within my control, right? um so I try to have some sense for that, and then um
Well, it sounds like there's two factors. It's like, what's within my control, and also what do I have domain expertise in?
yeah, like I guess basically like how good is my intuition in this subject area, right? And I think like this is there's something like a clever phrase for this, but it's like famous for X talks about Y, right? Like I don't
like a guru mentality.
yeah, I don't know. Noam Chomsky's the first person that comes to mind, which is kind of a political one to pick, but like he's famous for like I don't know that much about his like academic work, but like he
He's a linguist.
was a linguist, right? And he did I
Yeah.
think what's considered in the field some like really significant work about like history of language. I don't really know, but like he talks about he has a bunch of other political opinions and stuff, and you can find someone on the other side of the political aisle that does the same thing. I don't mean not so much partisan, but like how good are his intuitions about industrial policy? Like probably not good. You know what I mean? Like probably not good. Like he's like it's not his thing, right? Like same for me. Like it's not my thing. I don't know that much about it. It's like I guess I tend to be I tend to try to be cognizant of that. It's like I don't weigh in with some super strong opinion on most of these super macro issues because like
You
I
don't
don't know.
know.
I just realize
Yeah.
how little I know. I don't know. I listen to all that. I mean, I love reading about it and like learning about it, but like I'm so gullible in it. Like whatever like book I just read, I'm like, yep, that definitely makes sense. And then I'll read a book that says the exact opposite thing, and I'm like, no, that makes sense too. You know what I mean? It's just like, whereas like that's not the in a super discrete thing of like how to do your email marketing. Like I'll like, no, that's stupid. Like you definitely shouldn't do that. Like that's a bad idea. That's a good idea. Like I'm not super gullible. Like I'm like, okay, no, no, that's this is good. This is bad. It's sort of discrete. So I like try to have some judgment around like like big political economic issues like the Arab brands are just super wide for me. Like I don't, it's really hard for me to, do I have an intuition? Sure. But like my confidence level is just really low.
Well, you also don't. I think with email marketing as an example, you have hands-on, real-world experience. You saw if you pressed a certain button, it resulted in a certain outcome, and maybe it's even a more simple system as well. So, like you have real-world experience plus it's an easier, maybe not an easier, but like it's a more simple or a simpler system, and economic policy is not only more complex, but you've never set economic policy yourself, right?
Yeah. I think it is, but like, I don't like, does someone that's done 40 years of economic policy have amazingly good intuition? Like, I'm
Yeah,
like
not
dubious.
necessarily.
I mean, it's a sort
Yeah.
of Philip Tetlock has his whole like super forecaster um, sort of thing. And like a lot of the conclusion is like, it's really hard. Like who predicted the fall? Like, did someone that studied the Cold War for 40 years, like, was they that much better at predicting the fall of the Berlin Wall? Like, nope, they weren't. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Like,
Mm-hmm.
because it's really hard. It's just think that's super. Dave Snowden has he calls it the Cynefin framework, but like it's like simple, complicated, and complex problems. I think is like a nice way that I often think about it. Right. So like,
And there's three different types.
putting together a piece of IKEA furniture is a simple problem. There's a correct and an incorrect way to put together your piece of IKEA furniture. Fixing your car is like probably I could read a manual to an IKEA furniture. Fixing your car is complicated, and that like you can then probably email marketing is it's with sufficient domain knowledge you can arrive at a good solution. Maybe there's a right and wrong way to do IKEA. There's probably not a right and wrong way to do email marketing, but there's a range of good solutions and then a bunch of bad ones. Um, and then complex tends to be more, I don't know, that's for me more like Chinese man parable, which is like how
Unintended
much
consequences.
yeah how much does domain expertise matter? Yes, but even with domain expertise, probably still um
Bands of confidence.
extremely wide bands of confidence, right? Like even having 40 years of studying Cold War history and political dynamics did not make anyone sufficiently capable of like predicting the fall of the Berlin Wall, right? Like it's
Yeah.
just there's too much. It was way too much going on.
Fascinating. I like that the three different let's call it the three different types of problems, right? Simple, complex, and complicated. I had a friend who often said when you're looking at a problem, you need to figure out if it's a problem that's manageable or one that's solvable, and even getting to the answer on that tends to dictate
Yeah.
what your course of action would be. So if we're talking end of 2025, some of the, let's say, problems that I don't know,
face, this is a bad way to put it, but basically, like what I understood of Mutiny Fund, which was the hedge fund that you had set up, was you guys were looking at tail risks, and tail risks are things that are not likely to occur, but if they do occur, are going to have a very large impact, i.e., black swan events, and trying to basically hedge for those kind of tail risks. Is that an accurate description of the Mutiny Fund? Not
The
really.
50%. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, no, I guess I'd say like broadly the philosophy is okay. Financial markets are a complex system, which is to say, um, trying to like right. I'm trying to figure out like I have a lot of friends that like, oh, I like this stock or like that stock. Like my get like you are a amateur, non-professional invest business owner
Mm,
person, whatever. Like
mm,
the odds that you have outperformance ability picking single stocks over the next 10 years, I would benchmark to zero. Like
hmm.
I would take the opposite of that trade, basically 100% certainty, because it's so incredibly complex. Uh, you're competent. I mean, it's like it'd be to me it's like, oh well, I'm just gonna like train for the Olympics part time. Like I'll just do a little bit of Olympics training on this side. It's like no, you're going against the best, most motivated, capable people in the world that are
Who've just
that
put
are
in a lot more time.
they're doing way more on this than you are. And like your argument is like, oh, I'll like spend 2 hours a week on this and like be good at it. And I find that incredibly implausible. Certainly you can get like, can you get lucky and have perform? Absolutely. Right. Like that happens all the time. Um, and so I sort of like broadly that's,
Yeah, well, let me ask you something on that, because basically, so if you're, let's call it net, you're not positive about the individual stock picker outperforming the market, what are you doing with your money? Are you picking individual stocks?
no, I don't know. So
Okay.
I get kind of my broad view and the way that I've implemented this in the past is um, trying to get something as close to like a an agnostic portfolio, which is like broad stocks, broad bonds, broad commodities, some quantitative overlay stuff, of which like the tail risk would be one component. But basically, trying to take the perspective of like I don't think I can predict macroeconomic trends. Let's just assume I have zero predictive ability
Hmm.
around macroeconomic trends. Working back from that, what do I do? And I guess I said like I think one thing that people like you can be right about something but still lose money on it because it always depends what's priced in the market, right? Like I think this is a conversation now. People are like, oh, I think the U.S. economy is going to be the best. And it's like, well, the U.S. economy it may or may not be. Let's just take for granted that the U.S. economy is the best economy in the world and it's going to be for the next 20 years. Um, it doesn't mean it's going to equal its historical performance, right? Everything could do really bad. And B, something is already priced into the market, right? If something is priced in to grow at 10% and it grows at 8%, you lose money on that, right?
if
That's how
if
the
if if you bought it at the price it was selling at when the 10% was the common
correct, right? So
consent,
like
yeah.
inflation expectations are priced in, growth expectations are all these things are priced in, right? So like when you're buying this, you're basically saying I think the market expectation is wrong, right? Like I think that this is going to do better or worse for whatever reason than what's
Yeah,
being
that it's
so
underpriced. That's why I'm willing to trade my dollar for whatever the asset is,
right.
right? Yeah.
So my view is on anything macro, I have zero edge. I have
Hmm.
zero ability to say this stock or that stock, or even like stocks as a whole are like broadly over or underpriced. So yeah, my approach and the approach we use with the like strategy and stuff is let's start from that framework and then work back. So generally that's going to look like something super diversified, right? You want to have um, broad stock, broad bonds. I go like commodity exposure, and then you can do some derivative. There's I guess you can get increasingly complex with it, but as like a basic framework, that's more or less where I'm starting.
And was it country specific, or is it country specific? Is it all U.S. concentration or what?
No global. I mean, I guess to me again, that's like a this is like a funny people. I guess I was talking with someone that's a financial advisor, and they're talking about like everyone's like it's like smart to be passive investing right now. Like that's a cool like, oh, I'm passive. Like that's a smart thing. You would say that you're doing that at like a cocktail party, like, oh, that person's a smart, prudent person. They're like passive investing. But then people just want to like they're like, oh, I want to do passive investing, but I'm just gonna like put it all in US tech. It's like, well, it's not like the only like the only truly passive thing is I own a fractional percentage of every asset in the world, right? And in practice, that's impossible because there's a bunch of things you can't own because they don't, to me, like they don't exist or whatever. But like if you're like, oh, I'm passive, but I just do U.S. large cap stocks, like, well, you're making a huge active decision, which is to focus on U.S. large cap stocks, and that's fine if that's what you want to do. But like that's not, you're basically you're basically implicitly saying I think these are mispriced relative to everything else, right? I think these are going to outperform all the other things I could potentially
put the money into that I could buy with
allocate
my
to.
with yeah, like if it's
Yeah,
dollars or euros or seashells or whatever the unit of value
yeah.
is,
So
right? Yeah.
to me, the limit is it's mostly just like I can't own a fraction of all the real estate in my goal, but it just doesn't like there's not an instrument or mechanism by which I could possibly do that, right? But to the extent there are, um, you know, publicly tradable or accessible vehicles for doing those sorts of things, I want to be more or less as broad as possible. And then, I think, are there very specific things I want to buy a particular business where I think the email marketing is under optimized and I think I can double the like, oh, sure, right? But I'm making a very specific thing, which is I have control over this very one micro component of a very micro thing. And I think like that's Harry Brown has a great book called Fail Safe Investing from the 70s. And like he opens up with, I think it's my favorite investment book just because the first chapter is like, you being good at your job basically is like that's the thing. That's your alpha. That's where you make the money, right? Like if you're the best person in the world at email marketing, you don't need to pick stocks. It doesn't matter, right? You're going to you should be able to make so much money just doing email marketing that it's economically irrelevant. Whether like your just time and energy is so much better spent on or whatever, being the best OBGYN, any sort of thing, right? Like that,
Yep.
that's way more practical, right? So it's like that. It tends to be when it gets down to that level, right? Like being better at writing, being better at whatever my craft or trade or profession. I think like my agency in that domain is like pretty high, and so I think I tend to sort of segment it that way, which is like there's some like broad savings stuff. And with that, I want to be as diversified and as agnostic as possible because I don't think I have any control over that. And then at the very micro level, I want to be very opinionated
And intentional
and
about
intentional.
about the skills that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the OBGYN who's top of his field, the funds that he makes or she makes from being, the best OBGYN, they should turn around and put it into let's call it a passive, but a broadly diversified investment strategy that doesn't assume that just because they're an excellent OBGYN that they're also going to be an excellent stock picker.
Which is very common. Most excellent doctors do think that. I shouldn't say most. I said it's a very common archetype, which is like, actually, doctors in particular are the worst in my experience. But like, they're smart. I don't know. You're smart and hardworking. Like it's hard to become a doctor and be a good doctor. Like it's impressive. But like how, like I'd
How
be
does that
like,
lend itself to you managing money?
yeah. If you're one of the best options trader in the world, like, does that mean you can do open heart surgery? Like, nope. Like, it doesn't. You have no. You know what I mean? Maybe with 10 years of training, you could become. Like, maybe you have the capacity to become good at it. But like, sort of same thing, right? Like how translatable is being great at your individual thing to something that's even like plausibly, you run a great e-commerce store. Like, how good are you at picking tech stocks? Like, I don't think you're much better than I'm just dubious that that's that advantageous.
I want to ask you about you and I are also invested in crypto, and what percent in this allocation that you're talking about or that you're mentally modeling, what percentage is crypto? Does that fall under commodities? And then also inside of crypto as a bucket, I believe you own Bitcoin. Maybe you don't own anything else. Is Bitcoin the diversification play in crypto? And then how does Bitcoin fit into your overall asset allocation, if it does?
I've also, I'm not financial advice, do your own research, et cetera, et cetera. I'll give the disclaimer now that we're getting specific.
Thanks.
I'm not currently looking for an entity with regulated compliance, but I've been there. Low single digits as
In
part of
terms of
like a sort of,
allocation.
yeah, sort of like part of a broader portfolio. I don't like, there's a bunch of different like, sorry, going back to the broad asset allocation, like there's a bunch of different frameworks for like, okay, how do you size, okay, let's say you start with that, like how do you size things, like how much do you put in each of things, and like I'm not sure how interesting it is to go into the weeds there, but like one of the more popular approaches is to just look at like what the volatility of that thing is, right? And like something that's super volatile you probably don't want to own a ton of, because it's gonna drive your portfolio returns, right? So if you have 90% in T-bills and like 10% in crypto, like your portfolio returns are completely dominated by crypto, even though it's only 10%, right? Because the volatility is so high. Um, so crypto is like super, I haven't looked at it in a while, but I want to say it's like the one standard deviation annual volatility is like 75%, right? Which means like in a typical year, it's like going up and down 75%. It's like super bad. Stocks is like
Wow.
15%, gold's 20%. The 10-year treasury is like 5, just top ballpark numbers.
Mm-hmm.
So it's super volatile, which to me is like, all right, well, you want to be pretty conservative in how you're sizing it in that perspective. And then
They
I don't,
call it crypto for a reason, like holding on, right?
um, yeah, and yeah. And then I don't know. I think I don't know. Maybe when I got involved, and it was probably like mid 2010s, late 2010s, like it was kind of niche, and I thought maybe I know something someone else doesn't, but like I don't know anything. I know, is there like something about crypto that I know now that other people don't? Like no, I don't think that um there is sort of thing. And um so yeah, I think it's interesting. Like I think the technology is still super interesting. I think there's like active traded stuff you can do in crypto markets that's like interesting, but just as like sort of like a passive exposure thing. Like yeah, something in
Yeah,
the low single digits
but
seems
there's also like
appropriate.
a religious and a philosophical component to it, right? Maybe that's true with stocks as well, but like I think
Yeah.
crypto also incites in people especially Bitcoin.
If you've been on the
Yeah.
Bogleheads forum, I assure you it is also true in stocks.
Okay.
Um, for sure.
Yeah. Yeah, it's an
Um,
expression of one's worldview in a way, right?
yeah, I had some tweet that I thought was so clever and I was proud of like years ago. It was like people, like I was told growing up never to talk about religion, politics, or money. And the reason people get so upset about crypto is you're talking about all three at the same time.
Mm.
Sort of thing. And I think that's right. Like it symbolically represents all these incredibly um, sensitive
Complex.
and like emotional topics for people, right?
Mm.
And so people infuse all that emotion into the thing that it's a political statement, it's a religious statement, it's a um,
Economic statement. It's
all
like,
those
yeah, I
sorts
mean,
of things. Yeah,
yeah,
and as much as possible, I try. I guess
to
as an
avoid those things.
investor, I don't like whatever. I may have religious or political views, but like uh, that's not an investment decision, right? That's whatever, right? Like that's something else that I'm making a decision about for whatever reason.
Let's call it a matter of the heart instead of a matter of the head.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think
Let's
Taleb had a great. The last thing I'll say. I was just adjacent to that. He had a great line. It was like talking about political systems. But he's like, I think it was something like, "Be communist in your family, socialist in your neighborhood, democratic in your town, republican in your state, and libertarian in your
the
thing." And I
federal
just,
level, at the
yeah,
national
and
level, yeah.
I mean, like it's just kind of like, of course, we all have like, I'm fully communist with my family, right? Like, you know, um, to each as they deserve.
Charlie owns has a I don't know. Yeah, sorry.
Right. Yeah. I have no expectation that my 1-year-old is going to like be economically productive, right? Like, he just get whatever he needs. Yeah, of course. Like he's whatever he gets, he needs, sort of thing. So I think that I was kind of the same thing, right? Like it's like there's a the idea of like everything's sort of context dependent, right? Like there's an appropriate place for everything, or maybe not for everything, but different things have different appropriate places.
Amazing place to end on. Let's wrap up. Taylor, for those who've been listening, where should they go to follow you or support your work?
If you just Google my name, Taylor Pearson, it's probably the easiest. I'm somewhat active on Twitter. I have a website, and Brian mentioned I have just like a monthly reading newsletter I send out, so you can sign up for that on my site.
Yeah, and you're doing consulting as well. I don't know how much consulting you are still doing, but if you're looking to make better decisions, Taylor can listen to you and serve as both a consigliere and a psychotherapist, let's say, right?
Yeah, light on the psychotherapy, not my specialty. But
okay, yeah, lovely. Thanks for coming on, Taylor.
Yeah, thanks for having me, and thanks everyone for listening.
Hi again, folks. If you enjoyed the show, I've got a favor to ask. Would you mind leaving a positive review on iTunes, Spotify, or whichever platform you've been listening to this podcast on? Every one of those helps. If you didn't like the show, or if you've got feedback about it, let me know via the contact form on spreadgreatideas.org. I'd like to hear from you as far as what can be done to improve. So again, if you enjoyed the show, then please help out by spreading the word. And if you didn't, let me know how to improve it. Thanks a lot for your attention, and I hope you'll check out the next one. Thank you.